This isn't a story from Agatha Christie, nor an episode from Sherlock Holmes, but what's happening now behind the screens has become difficult to understand for some, and on the other hand, it's a readable book for the few conscience out there. It's nothing new what we're hearing now. The sane and discerning ones now know that Uncle Sam has come with his new theater on the vast Orient land with more than 10 shows. The war started on terrorism and the alleged mass destruction weapon on the people of Iraq. Then the shows went towards the plague and epidemic, starting from cow madness and bird flu, leading to the virus of SARS and COVID, and the show of the new era. So the shouts of the elite administrators got higher and higher, worried for the safety of the poor and helpless people. So they compelled death lest anyone to die, and the number 70 was their aim. And after reaching it in the majority of the vaccinated, the government suddenly stopped the restraints without further notice, and the epidemic has become nothing but a catch cold that happens once in a while. And chapter 6 of the theatric show has ended on the English and Spanish lands, and a group of other countries have later on joined, shouting and loudly saying no vaccination, no news anymore. The rep of the old temple whispered years ago and stated that the show ends only when the 70% is injected in the arms of the publics. And as for the rest of the countries where the theatric is still on, you'll suddenly hear when the chosen number is reached that the show is over and the danger is gone.
Fortunately, this isn't measles. We don't need over 90% of people to take the vaccine. We think an additional, it could be as high as 60%, but somewhere between 30 to 60% of the population taking the vaccine, if it's on the high end of the effectiveness range, which one or two of the beginning ones won't, but some of the 6 will be, then you'll just stop.
And today, years from now, the 7th theatric show has started in the name of war between the neighbors. So the roles of the play were divided on Uncle Sam's stage, and America took the leader and Warner part in it. And politicians went on shouting, "The countdown has begun. This is the moment of truth." It's a story that goes on and on, told to people whom their power was taken by force, and the light in their hearts was blown out. This is the reality of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine land, the story of the 7th theatric show of Uncle Sam. In 2014, the so-called Ukrainian Revolution or the Revolution of Dignity took place, a series of violent events between demonstrators and riot police in the capital city Kiev led to the expulsion of the former president Viktor Yanukovych and making Ukraine nothing but a town belonging to Russia. The reason of that revolution was a result of a large Western media campaign led by the Americans that was directed to the Ukrainians under the name of liberty, retrieving dignity, and to rise up from underneath the Russian subjection. The Russians knew that America and the European Union were responsible for the extraction of their minion in Kiev and taking down the Russian authority there. Russia considered Yanukovych's overthrow as an illegitimate coup and didn't acknowledge the provisional government taken by the Gladio, the secret NATO army there, and the unknown cabal that contributed to the overthrow of the regime. Massive pro-Russian and anti-revolutionary demonstrations took place under the American cover in the eastern and southern regions of the country. It ended with Russia's complete acquisition of Crimea in 2014 and establishing an independent state in Donetsk and Luhansk. However, Ukraine fell into the hands of Westerners with America behind them, and Petro Poroshenko became president of Ukraine after a landslide victory in the elections held immediately in 2014. And the new government brought back the amendments to the Ukrainian constitution of 2004 And in this way, America closed in on Russia and achieved through this revolution three things. The first is to isolate Ukraine from Russian influence. The second is to turn it into a European subordinate state. And the third and most important thing is to incite the Russians to storm it militarily and to obtain international legitimacy to impose sanctions, which weakens it economically and logistically and will harm it militarily.
But if Russia attacks Ukraine, it would be a war of choice, and we are ready to respond decisively to Russian attack on Ukraine.
However, the Russians were aware of the danger of this step against Ukraine, especially that Turkey at the time was closing the Black Sea to the Russians by order of America, which isolated the Russians for many years behind these waters. At that time in 2014, it was the left who ruled America as it is today, led by the Democratic Party. It was publicly noted that they gave the green light to the Russians to enter the Crimea, and in the same context, the media played a rhetoric of sanctions and a decisive response. And only a few months later, crossing points were opened to the Crimea, which became the only solution for the Russians in order to preserve the national security of the country.
Мы идем домой! Крым в России! Ура, товарищи!
Despite their prior knowledge that its occupation would serve the American Western power and would give it permission to impose sanctions. But the Russians' interest in it was great, and there's no escape from this tight American trap. But America didn't realize at the time that China was preparing for a powerful ally to lead the world, and that this ally will be Russia. In 2016, 2 years after these events, the PJD's actions fell outside the scope of the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. Confirmed information was revealed that Turkey is conducting regional agreements with the Russians on both the military and economic levels.
First delivery of the S-400 system was flown into the Murted airbase near the capital Ankara, with several more scheduled over the next few days. The US says it's ready to impose sanctions and is threatening to stop supplying Turkey with its F-35 fighter jets. Selim Korsioli has more from Istanbul.
The Turkish deep state, loyal to the global left party, decided under a direct order from the ruling deep state to prepare a huge military coup against the Turkish president Erdogan, but it failed and generated the direct spark for the Turkish movement towards Russia and China in the camp of the Eastern Alliance against the American Western one. However, the Russians' first and main condition was to open the Black Sea completely, but things don't work out this way like in Hollywood movies, because Turkey to this day is under the umbrella of NATO led by America. However, Uncle Sam knows very well how to run things, so he made a sudden secret decision to give the green light to the Turks to open the Black Sea to the Russians. At the same time, he mobilized a large military force in Greece in preparation for any Turkish exit from underneath the American Western umbrella towards the Eastern Chinese Russian one. The hidden objective of this decision is to drag the Russians into a regional war. Let me simplify things for you. America always plays the role of a remote observer and only intervenes in the last moments. That is when it's time to collect the spoils. In World War I, it entered just months before the end of the war, and in the Second War it acted as a rear supporter for the Russians and the Europeans, and in both cases it was the biggest winner. After World War II, Britain was exhausted, and America assumed leadership of the world after it got rid of all its debts in the name of war, and its economy grew insanely quick from the agreements concluded after the war, especially the petrodollars. That is America, that aims to start wars but from the back seats. This is why it aims to drag Russia into a regional war. We'll explain later on its gains in this documentary. After these events and at the beginning of 2018, Russia remained without any movements to restore Ukraine despite the opening of the way for it because it was aware of the American trap. And at the same time, the Sino-Russian alliance was officially announced on all levels, meaning that the game is now being played on the American court. So America immediately besieged China through Japan, South Korea, and Asian countries, and at the same time deployed NATO forces near the Russian Federation. And in unprecedented step, America withdrew completely from Afghanistan after the Mujahideen there inflicted the scourge of war for 20 years without submission or defeat. But the Americans don't leave anything unused. They even used their own defeat, for after withdrawing from Afghanistan, they indirectly armed the Taliban through regional mediators in order to build a solid wall in the face of the Russians. The same old method that they followed against the Soviet Union when they opened the way for the Mujahideen to cross the Afghan land. The Russians know very well that their entry through Afghanistan is a path to hell. This is a land that broke the two greatest countries in the world. The Taliban showed their lack of understanding of the Americans' game, and they used the weapons in their hands to protect the country and not to engage in a war that would only serve the Americans as it was. The American plan is now exposed, and the Sino-Russian forces have begun to grow deeply in the world, which it may lead to overthrow the American Western power forever. The Americans adopted a new and very cunning policy to drag the Russians towards a war in a new quagmire, a provoking way by deploying NATO forces on the Russian borders in a public threat to Russian security in early 2020. At the same time, they pressured Ukraine to enter under the NATO umbrella under the pretext of protecting it from the Russians, which will force the Russians to take immediate actions to confront this dangerous matter that explicitly threatens its national security. And here, the Russians have no choice but to annex Ukraine to the Russian Federation, and in this way America will win several consecutive points. The first point, dragging the Russians towards war. The second, making them a military threat around the necks of the European countries, which are now getting out of the Americans' control. The third is to put the European countries under threat, so they head towards America. The fourth is that America is trying to plunge the European countries into a long war against the Russians with China behind. And that's through material support with weapons, equipments, and the proxy war game. And the fifth point is to generate a third world war in which America is the indirect party, while Europeans collide with Arabs in a war against China and Russia, in which Uncle Sam's country will be the biggest winner by weakening and exhausting all forces and overruling the world again. However, the Arab rulers at this juncture will resort to the Eastern umbrella under the power of China and Russia. So America will resort to isolating them in advance and handing over the countries to the Islamists, as it knows very well that the Islamic jihadist doctrine is the only thing capable of stopping China and Russia, and the land of the Afghans is the best witness and proof of that. But I believe that this step will be the major spark for the re-emergence of the Islamic force. As for Europe, it doesn't trust America at all and can deviate from its will. It has repeatedly asked for the secrets of manufacturing advanced weapons, but the Americans refused this request, fearing of the independence of the European Union and the collapse of the American alliance. As for the sixth and final point, it's the game of economy. This crisis that America's created has contributed to raising the prices of gas, wheat, and many other major commodities from which billions of dollars will soon be gained. European countries today fear the interruption of natural gas coming from the Russian pipelines, as this matter is very dangerous and could lead to a huge nail being inserted into the European coffin. Also, the explosion that occurred in the Nord Stream pipelines is something that Europe considered a harbinger of disaster, which will soon push it into absolute submission to Uncle Sam on open terms. From all what's been mentioned, it's clear to every seasoned politician that America is the one that wants to bring Russia into this war, and the scapegoat here is Ukraine, which has become a victim of this dispute, or rather of this game. After the coup that took place in it, they made Ukraine head towards NATO, which was a red line for the Russians. For the crisis isn't between Russia and Ukraine, according to what the media is saying, but rather between Russia and the USA, which is the leader of NATO today. Someone will say that the Russians aren't that naive to be deceived by the American trap, so why did they carry out this military operation? The answer isn't for the sake of war, as it's rumored. This war is nothing but a TV show war. The real war that America is planning for is a global war in which it aims to subjugate the great powers, as happened in World War II. As for Russia, the goal of this military operation is to subjugate Ukraine and stop the extension of NATO forces, which are now on the outskirts of Russia on the one hand and China on the other, while completely taking over the Turkish border from the Greek side. Let me draw your attention to a point that will be a proof of America's desire for the Russians to invade Ukraine. America announced its retreat from cutting the SWIFT banking system from Russia. It evacuated its citizens and withdrew the ambassador from Ukraine, and opened all windows for the Russians to enter the trap, and didn't take the same measures it took to stop China from annexing Taiwan, when it immediately sent nuclear submarines there and stopped the Chinese movement against Taiwan. Although stopping the movement is only temporary, but what's happening now is confirmed facts in which America seeks through to plunge the Russians into the quagmire of wars. And from a personal point of view, we find that these steps taken by America will literally lead to the end of Uncle Sam's country and bringing the world into a violent conflict that will turn all the scales upside down. As the Western power today is pressing towards moving the world to a third world war and with multiple scenarios, sometimes between India and Pakistan and once in China and Taiwan, by igniting tension between the Russians and Ukraine, and this tension will soon extend to the Arab and African regions that need that one spark in order for the major things to happen. And I tell you with most certainty that these harbingers are nothing but signs of the end of the century of Satan and the emergence of a new high sun over the top of the White Castle.